Anything else from the state before the defense gets Mr. Davenport back in here?
No, just want to flag for the court that I expect that perhaps today, I've been told by the defense, we might get to some of their experts, which by agreement, each side has allowed their corresponding expert to sit in court.
So we might see Mr. Driscoll back in here. We might see the sleep person that you have in here, whomever. Okay, just like we had, I think his name was Mr. Gardner, who's in here.
That's correct.
For a whole lot of stuff. This will include your expert.
Yeah.
Okay, and I remember Mr. Paul was in there. That's right. Okay. Ms. Clark Palmer, anything from the defense before we bring the jury in? Is Mr. Davenport here?
He's sitting outside.
Great. Okay. Why don't you guys go get him while we bring the jury up?
All jurors are present in the county court, Judge.
Good morning, jurors. Good morning. Happy Tuesday. Again. Wednesday. This week's been flying by. Look at that. Let me see if I'm in the right place. Yeah, my calendar says State versus McIver. Okay. Well, I'm glad I made it to the right place. Happy Wednesday. Another Wednesday that we're together as well. I do know this much. When we stopped last night, whatever night it was, Mr. Davenport was on the stand, graciously returned from mid-Georgia, and is now going to be subject to cross-examination. Mr. Abate, at least last night, was going to be the attorney from the state who's going to conduct the cross-examination. And we'll go from there. So happy Wednesday, and thank you for orienting me to at least time, if not place. And Mr. Abate, when you're ready.
Thank you, Judge. Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning, Mr. Davenport.
Good morning.
Now, yesterday you said you were employed with Arcilla Mining Company.
Yes, sir. Arcilla Mining and Land Company.
Okay. And you have been employed there since July of 2010, about 8 years?
June of 2010.
Okay. And you're the CFO?
Correct. Chief Financial Officer.
And have you been the CFO the entire time while working with Arcilla?
I came in originally as a controller, but within the first year, Mr. Ted had promoted me to CFO.
And how do you know Mr. Ted?
Mr. Ted is, let's see, he is a family friend. My wife is from Milledgeville, and her parents, family friends with Mr. Ted and his wife. So I have known Mr. Ted since probably 2007. So, and then he was looking to do an expansion of the company in 2010. And then I was looking to make a change in my job in 2010. And both opportunities kind of, it was a good opportunity for both.
And you were a controller when you first started. What does a controller do?
Pretty much the same thing as a CFO, just at a lower level, it's just a lower title.
And I believe you said you got your undergrad at Auburn as well as your master's in accounting from Auburn?
Yes, sir.
And we'll try not to hold that against you.
Thank you.
Now, I believe you also said that at some point you had a CPA license,
That's correct.
but that license has since lapsed.
I have not maintained the license.
Okay, so it's lapsed.
Yes, sir.
And when did it lapse?
I'm not sure.
Okay, before or after you started working with Arcilla Mining and Land Company?
Probably before.
Okay. And now, I believe yesterday you kind of described on direct some of your job responsibilities and duties as the CFO. And I believe some of them where you said that you kept track of payroll, accounts payable, I think you said accounts receivable, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Now, what you didn't reference is, I guess, your job required you to evaluate or come up with an evaluation for any businesses, isn't that correct?
An evaluation for any businesses?
Yes, or for, I guess, to come up with the value of what Arcilla is, I guess, worth.
No, sir, I don't have a specialization in business valuation.
Okay, so you don't, as part of your job duties, evaluate any, I guess, evaluate what the value of any of the interest in the company would be then?
No, sir, I typically just run operations for the company and run financials for the company.
So you pretty much just run numbers, correct?
That's correct.
So nothing about your job involves you coming up with any sort of value for, I guess, any part of the business?
Specifically for Arcilla?
Yes.
No, but we have looked at other companies to acquire in the past, and we have entered into negotiations with other companies. So I have attempted to value other companies in the past, and we have closed on those, some transactions. We closed on one transaction, and we didn't close on another transaction.
And when was that?
We closed on one transaction in in October of 2015, and then we were pursuing another transaction of a different business in 2014 time, but we did not close on that.
Okay. And I think yesterday you referenced the EBITDA evaluation or multiplier.
Yes, sir.
Did you use that in the evaluation of the companies that you were attempting to acquire or eventually did acquire?
We utilized it in one. The second one was kind of an asset-based, debt-based, equity-based approach on the second one. So we utilized EBITDA for one evaluation. We didn't utilize it on the second one.
And you keep saying we. Who is we?
Myself and Mr. Ted Smith.
And who did the majority of, I guess, the evaluation or the use of the EBITDA multiplier? Was it him or was it you?
It's a combination of the two.
And had you ever done that before?
No, sir, not prior to that.
So would it be fair to say that your experience with using EBITDA multipliers or EBITDA evaluation process is very limited?
You could say that, but we've also looked at a processing plant in Eufaula, and we have had different negotiations with different potential buyers of that processing plant. So we've kind of gone through a little bit of an EBITDA multiplier valuation with some large-scale companies for the potential acquisition of a processing plant that Mr. Ted owns in Eufaula. So granted, it is limited, my knowledge, but I've done it a few times.
Okay, and what I think I'm hearing you say is that you've done it twice.
No, I've done it twice with Arcilla, and then with Mr. Ted's process. It was a processing plant he followed. We've been in negotiations with 4 other companies. So that has utilized some type of EBITDA multiplier valuation.
Okay, and then yesterday when speaking with Ms. Clark Palmer, you referenced inferred drilling. Do you remember that?
Yes, sir.
Now, you don't have any part in the process of inferred drilling, correct?
No, sir, I do not.
And you haven't been trained how to do, I guess, the process or the steps of inferred drilling?
No, sir. I've looked at drill logs, and from the drill logs, I've been able to see the overburden, which is the dirt on top, and I've been able to see the kaolin grain, which is the amount of footage of kaolin, and I've entered that in for invoicing purposes for different customers that we may be drilling their land on. But in terms of being able to compile drill data from different drill logs and map out drill data onto a grid map, I don't have experience with that, and I don't have experience calculating volumetrics of the estimated tonnage on a property.
Okay, so if I'm hearing you correctly, what you're saying is you deal with, again, just the numbers after the inferred drilling is done.
Yes, sir, you can say that.
And when you're dealing with the numbers, you're really just inputting the numbers that you received from the log into your system or whatever you're attempting to, I guess, evaluate.
Yes, sir.
Now, yesterday, Ms. Clark Palmer showed you State Exhibit 148. Do you remember this letter from Arcilla?
Yes, sir, I do.
Okay. And you didn't write this letter, correct?
No, sir, I did not write this letter.
And looking at the signature, Mr. Ted Smith wrote the letter, correct?
Yes, sir, that's correct.
And I think you said yesterday you checked it, or you had seen it and checked it for grammar and punctuation, correct?
That's correct. I typically will go through grammar, punctuation, also syntax, and help make the sentences sound better sometimes.
Okay.
So,
But it's fair to say you had absolutely nothing to do with the actual content of the letter, correct?
yes, sir, that's correct.
And did you have anything to do with the evaluation or the numbers that were actually put in this letter?
No, sir.
And is your only, I guess, knowledge of what's in this letter based on what Mr. Ted told you?
You're referring to the dollar amounts, or
Yes.
what are you referring to?
The dollar amounts? Well, the entire letter and the dollar amounts.
Yeah, I mean, this letter was written by him. It provides dollar amounts in there, but I think I could see how he came up with some of those numbers.
Okay, and I apologize, I'll ask a better question. After talking about this letter, Ms. Clark Palmer kind of walked through Mr. McIver's 10% interest in Arcilla Mining and Land, correct?
Yes, sir. Mr. McIver has a company called Arcilla Resources, and Arcilla Resources had a 10% ownership of Arcilla Mining Land and Arcilla Trucking Company.
Okay. And what was your part in the actual evaluation process to determine that 10% interest was worth $700,000?
I came up with an EBITDA-based valuation for Arcilla Mining Land Company, presented it to Mr. Ted, and then based upon that valuation, he and Mr. McIver came to an agreement for the $700,000
Okay.
purchase.
And you said you came up with the EBITDA evaluation number.
Yes, sir.
How did you do that?
I looked at our results for 2014 through 2015, 2016, and expected results for 2017. So we calculated EBITDA each year and then took an average of each of the 3 actual years and then the expected upcoming year for 2017, and then we pulled a multiplier of 3%, or excuse me, 3 multipliers. So in effect, we came up with an average EBITDA of 2.25, and then multiplied it by 3.
Now, that valuation multiplier, has it been audited recently?
No, sir.
Okay. And so it hasn't been audited?
Who would audit it?
I guess I'll ask you the question, who would audit it?
I don't know.
Okay. And I guess who checks the multiplier that you use to determine if it's correct?
It's just that typically when you're projecting a multiplier, you look at what your amount of expected business is for the next, 3 years, 5 years, 7 years, 9 years. Some multipliers can range up to 9 depending upon the industry. We chose a multiplier of 3. We could have chosen a multiplier of 4 or 5, but we chose a multiplier of 3 based upon expected remaining contract life for some of our service contracts.
So the entire, I guess, evaluation process and the numbers and multipliers that went into it were all based on something you did?
Yes, sir, and reviewed by Mr. Ted.
Reviewed by Mr. Ted?
Yes, sir.
Now, of this number that Ms. Clark Palmer, I'll zoom in, asked you about, this 1.5 to 2.5 million dollar range, okay? What percentage of the 10% interest is that number?
Well, the purchase agreement that we've looked at is $700,000.
Okay.
So, but you could make a claim that some of the value of Arcilla was more than that. And then you also could make a claim that some of his mineral interest was $700,000. So,
Okay, so, let me make sure I understand. You paid, or what's being paid out for the 10% interest of Mr. McIver's interest in Arcilla Mining is $700,000, correct?
that's what the purchase agreement was for.
Okay, so is it fair to say that if you take 1.5 minus $700,000, the remaining would be the interest or what the estimated value of the land is?
That's what I would estimate based off the remainder. So this is, again, it's Mr. Ted's number that he put out there.
So you don't know?
No, I don't have a valuation of his mineral
I'm
interest.
sorry, Mr. Davenport, if I could object to the question, because yesterday when I tried to elicit about his knowledge, I got a hearsay objection. So I think my objection is it's not that he doesn't know, but what the
You
foundation of
shouldn't
his
say
knowledge
what
is.
he thinks. What's your objection?
To the form of the question, I think it mischaracterizes the evidence.
Okay. I thought the question was, so you don't know the origins of all these numbers because it's Mr. Smith's letter. But if it was something different, why don't you ask the question again? And then if you have an objection to the question, that's fine. Just don't start supplying an answer for the witness.
And I think my question was after you explained the $700,000, I asked you what the remaining interest or if the remaining interest was the estimated value of these alleged tracts of land. And you said, I think you were unsure, that was Mr.
Just
Ted's
ask the question and we'll let him answer.
Right, what was your answer to that?
The remainder value, is I'm assuming it's coming from the estimated mineral worth of the tracts that Mr. Ted references.
And then my next question was, so you don't know?
No, I'm relying on Mr. Ted.
Okay. Now, do you remember speaking to me, I guess, around last Friday?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And do you remember telling me that your knowledge about the alleged tracts of land was very limited?
Yes, sir.
And that, to your knowledge, the land hadn't been tested since the early 1990s?
Yes, sir.
And do you remember that you didn't tell me that the land had ever been actually drilled upon or mined on?
I did not know that it had not.
Okay, so when you said that yesterday, was that because Mr. Ted told you that it had been mined on?
I think from a mining standpoint, I've looked at the check register where all checks written to Arcilla Resources. So, and I saw some royalty payments on a monthly basis that were sent to Arcilla Resources. So from that, I inferred that it had been mined upon because we had been writing royalty checks. So, but any mining that may have occurred prior to my time with Arcilla.
So you're assuming that they've been mined upon based on the numbers that you looked in your, I guess, your logs, your system, correct?
Yes, sir, based upon a check register.
And you also remember telling me that you had no idea where these tracts of land were.
After we had a discussion, so I was inquisitive about it, and I pulled up the property tax records, and I realized that one of the tracts was in Twiggs County, and it's really close to where we're currently mining, literally next to where we're currently mining to the west, and also where we're currently mining to the north.
So the answer to my question would be no, you didn't know anything about it.
No, sir.
And I'll repeat my question. I asked you, when we spoke on Friday, do you remember telling me that you didn't know where these tracts of land were.
Yes, sir, when we spoke on Friday, I stated that I was unaware of where these tracks were.
And you remember saying that if you were given a map, you wouldn't be able to locate them anywhere on the map. You remember saying that?
Yes, sir. I said that at the time.
And I guess now your knowledge about the land has occurred after we spoke.
Yes, sir. After we spoke, since I did not know where they were located, I decided to look them up. And once I looked them up, I realized that we're mining right next to them.
When you say them,
I'm sorry, right next to the tracks. Sorry.
Okay. And you said where mining, who owns, you talked about the two tracts, I guess, that are surrounding this one tract. Who owns those tracts?
LLC, a Fin and Feather LLC, which is owned by a man from Sandersville. And then the tract to the north is owned by T.S. Smith Development and Gaywood Timber Company.
Okay. So the one tract is partly owned by Mr. Ted?
Yes, sir. The one to the north is 50% owned by T.S. Smith Development, which is owned by Mr. Ted. And then it's 50% owned by Gaywood Timber Company.
And you said that the royalties on this one tract hadn't been paid since 2004, correct?
You're referencing our civil resources tract?
Yes.
Yes, sir.
And I guess why did the royalties stop?
I don't know why they stopped. You can stop mining for a few reasons.
You don't know, you don't have to.
Okay, well,
You don't know.
tell you. But
if you know, you can tell us, but
Okay.
if you're guessing as to why.
Okay. I was going to give you examples of why we messed up, but that's I don't know why that particular track stopped.
But if is one of the reasons that drilling would or mining would stop on a piece of property is because there is no more kaolin on it.
Yes, sir, potentially.
And that could be potentially why the drilling or mining stopped on Mr. McIver's tract of land, correct?
Potentially, but you've got other reasons as well.
Okay. Well, I'll just go ahead and ask you, what are those other reasons?
Reduction in customer demand. You could also find another piece of property where the royalties are cheaper, so your cost of mining will go down significantly if you've acquired cheaper kaolin. So those are the main two reasons.
And when you say reduction in customer, you say customer demand?
Yes, sir, customer demand. Customer demand plays a big role in our current mining. Right now is customer demand increases for certain kaolin. We're actively going out and aggressively seeking more kaolin for particular types of kaolin to meet that demand. So customer demand does play a role.
So is it fair to say that there is no, or that the customer demand for Mr. McIver's piece of land is very low since it hasn't been mined or drilled upon?
Potentially.
Well, if customer demand was high, is it fair to say that there would be mining or drilling being done on that tract of land?
Well, you could also go with my second option of having cheaper reserves. So paying a cheaper royalty for similar kaolin, but instead of paying $2 a ton, you could pay $1 per ton.
But if you were in a situation where you were in debt or needed money, is it fair to say that you would allow mining to occur on your tract of land?
I'm going to
Go ahead.
object to that question.
I'll withdraw.
Okay.
In your brief, I guess, researching about that tract of land, do you know if it has any encumbrances on it?
Typically, I don't handle that aspect of research for a land.
So you don't know?
No, sir, I do not know.
Now, how much, so of that $700,000 that, what, I guess was the, what was, I want to phrase this without getting any objections, hold on. valued based on your, I guess, EBITDA process, the 10% interest of Mr. McIver's interest in Arcilla to be $700,000, correct?
My valuation?
Yes.
It was actually a little bit higher than that.
Okay. How much of that or equity did Mr. McIver actually get? Did he get the full 700? Was it lower than that?
We have a purchase agreement.
Mhm.
I don't know if it's been looked at or not, but it's for $700,000. Of the 700, Mr. McIver had already taken draws of $125,000 prior to that. So effectively, you have $575,000 at the date of signing. At the date of signing, we sent a check for $200,000 in January, and then another $50,000 30 days after that. This is January 17th. And then we had a promissory agreement for the remaining balance of $325,000 to be paid out in over 5 years at 4% interest, roughly $73,000 a year.
And how many of those payments has been, I guess, fulfilled?
One so far.
So how much is still owed to the defendant?
It'd be roughly $325,000 less $73,000.
You're good with numbers, not me.
I'm doing it right now in my head. Roughly $250,000.
Okay. I'm going to take your word for it.
Okay, thank you.
Now, I want to ask a question about something you said at the very beginning about he had already drawn down $125,000. What do you mean by that?
In 2012, we sent a check or a wire transfer for $105,000. Of that wire transfer, Mr. Ted and Mr. McIver had noted that $70,000 would be a draw against any potential future buyout, and then $35,000 was for $35,000 was for his income taxes. So Arcilla Resources received a K-1, which is a tax form from Arcilla Mining Land Company for his portion, its 10% portion of income that Arcilla Mining Land generated. So if Arcilla Mining Land Company generated $1 million in income for a year, 10% of that would be attributable to Arcilla Resources. So Arcilla Resources would have a taxable increase, or an income increase of $100,000. Its likely tax burden for that $100,000 of income was maybe $35,000, $45,000, I'm not sure. But that's where the $30,000 comes into, was to cover any income pushed to Arcilla Resources by Arcilla Mining Land Company.
So the $70,000 of that, I guess 125 was a loan, correct?
No, sir. It was didn't treat it as a loan. We treated it as a draw against any potential future buyout.
But it's a loan. Is it fair to say that it's a loan of $70,000 until there's a buyout, correct?
Yes, sir. We didn't expect it to be repaid, so we expected to apply it against the future potential, against the future buyout.
And I guess I'm confused, since you said you didn't expect it to be repaid. So if there wasn't a buyout, Mr. Ted or Arcilla didn't expect to get the $70,000 back?
I think at some point, Mr. Ted and Mr. McIver knew that there would be a sale of his 10% interest. They didn't know when that would occur, but at some point they're expected to be a sale. So I'm assuming now that there had been discussion that this would be applied against any potential future sale.
And I appreciate your assumption, but my question is if there wasn't a buyout, is it your understanding that Mr. Ted didn't expect to get paid the $70,000 back?
If there was never a buyout, I expect that Mr. Ted would have expected to be repaid the $70,000.
So he would have been expected to pay, Mr. McIver would have been expected to pay the $70,000 that he had, for lack of better words, been loaned in 2012.
Yes, sir. There was never a potential buyout, but I believe it had been discussed.
Okay. Now, I just want to bring your attention to one more thing in the letter. You read it yesterday, and at the very bottom says, this evaluation of this letter is to, I'll read it verbatim and ask a question. This evaluation is to be considered strictly confidential and is not to be used as an appraisal, submitted as evidence, or as an official document. Do you remember reading that?
Yes, sir.
So, is your understanding that this letter is not supposed to be used in court here today?
Well,
I don't know.
Okay.
withdraw.
All right. Yes and no.
You don't know?
No, sir, I do not know.
And based on your, you have an undergrad degree, correct?
Yes, sir. I've got an undergrad and a master's degree
So you're-
from Auburn.
You're a very smart guy despite going to Auburn.
Despite that, yes, sir.
It says it's not to be used as an appraisal or submitted as evidence. What does that mean to you?
Well, Your Honor,
I'm just asking what it means to him.
I understand what you're asking, but there's still an objection.
I would object to relevance. I would object to relevance. And
Okay.
also that the document says what it says.
Right, and we've heard that refrain before, I think for good reason. It says what it says, and unless you're going to lay a foundation for Mr. Davenport to be a contractual or legal expert to say this is the legal meaning of that sentence, then he would be providing his version of Merriam-Webster's meaning, and I don't think that's relevant. So I'll sustain the objection at this point.
I don't think I have any further questions, but thank you, Mr. Davenport.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Clark Palmer?
Yes. Thank you, and good morning again, Mr. Davenport.
Good morning.
So Mr. Abadi was asking you about, the 1.5 and 2.5 million number in this document and whether you knew where that came from. You told us that you did, or did you calculate the value of Mr. McIver's minority shares in Arcilla Mining and Land Company?
Yes, ma'am, I did.
All right. And this letter, this line of the letter that talks about the EBITDA, is that how you say it?
Yes, ma'am.
EBITDA-based calculation for his minority shares, is that the same calculation that you did?
Yes, ma'am.
All right. So, is it fair to say, if you know, that for some portion of this dollar amount, it depends on a calculation that you performed?
Yes, ma'am. You could say that.
All right. Is it fair to say that the remaining dollar amount, however else we get up to the 1.5 to the 2.5 million dollar number in this letter, that's not a valuation or calculation that you did?
That's correct.
Okay. But, the second part of this sentence references on the 3 tracts that Mr. McIver has an interest in, and you know of 1 tract that Mr. McIver has an interest in.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. And you told us about some of the reasons why mining would stop on a piece of land, right?
Yes, ma'am.
Is one of the reasons why, in addition to the ones you told us, may another reason why mining might stop on a piece of land be that the value of kaolin has gone down?
Potentially, a lot of it is due to demand for particular types of kaolin. Kaolin has traditionally been a paper-based material, so it's going into paper. So with a reduction in demand for paper, those particular types of kaolin that went into the paper industry, you could make the argument that that valuation has gone down. So, but there are other types of kaolin that have increased in value due to increased demand or increased industries that require it.
Okay. Can you tell us that, well, the tract that you know about that Mr. McIver has an interest, is there a name to that tract? Is there some easier way to refer to it?
I don't know.
Okay. All right, well, that tract that you know about that Mr. McIver has an interest in, you said you saw the royalties for that tract stop being paid in what year?
2004.
All right. Do you know whether there are still kaolin deposits on that piece of land?
No, ma'am, I don't have that knowledge.
Can you say that because royalties were stopped being paid, that means there is no more kaolin on that land?
No, ma'am, I don't know that either.
All right. And Mr. Abadi also asked you about some conversations that you had with him before today, right?
Yes, ma'am.
How many different times have you had conversations with other people from the district attorney's office other than Mr. Abati?
Our office was visited by, I believe, a detective. I've got his card in my wallet, but I can't recall his name right now. I had a conversation with him, and Mr. Ted and he were meeting in a conference room, and Mr. Ted had a question over the check register. So I was pulled into that conversation to explain some of the royalties and some of the tax payments. So I've had that conversation. And then my other conversations were with Mr. Abate.
Okay. So at least 3 conversations you had with somebody who was a member of the district attorney's office?
I believe so. I believe I've had 2 conversations with Mr. Abate, and then I had a conversation with that detective.
And I don't want to ask you specifically what anybody said, but those 3 conversations, was the general subject of those conversations dealing with Mr. McIver's interests in Arcilla Mining and Land Company, as well as tracts of land he may have an interest in?
I'm going to object if this isn't in the scope of, this is outside the scope of trial.
I thought that Mr. Abadi was asking questions about conversations that this witness had had with himself, and so that's the topic that I'm exploring.
Okay. I'll remember the question.
I need to repeat it. I'm sorry.
Okay. Those 3 conversations, without telling me what anybody said, was the general subject of those conversations about Mr. McIver's interests in Arcilla Mining and Land Company and tracts of land he may have an interest in.
And I'm going to object again as to hearsay.
Okay.
So, Your Honor, there were many witnesses who came and testified during the state's case in chief, where the state would ask a question such as,
Let's say this is
well,
Just let her finish.
you know, did you talk to Danny Joe about the details of the shooting or the incident in the car? Yes, I did. Okay, I don't want to ask you to tell me what she said. Same type of question.
So the fact that one side didn't object to what the other side did isn't basis to say you should overrule an objection. If you want the jury to rely upon this witness saying, we talked about subject X, you are offering his observation, his recollection of the subject matter for the truth of the matter asserted. So I'm not disagreeing with what has happened with other witnesses, either on cross-examination, and there was no objection from the state, or on direct examination, and there was no objection from the defense. Wisely, people don't object every time they can. But I'll let you respond in a second. But it does seem to me, unless I'm missing it, that you are asking this witness to effectively summarize, was the topic, at least in part, X? I am offering, at a court statement, a summary of it for the truth of the matter asserted. So if you can show me how that's not the right analysis, then I'll let you proceed. But otherwise, I agree with you that there have been times that both sides have asked questions like that, and the other side didn't object. But we're dealing with a hearing now.
Well, I was going to say, my memory is, I think on some of those occasions, you know, we did object. But my answer to what you just said is that I'm not seeking an out-of-court statement, you know, what did the investigator say or what did you say in this conversation, but more just to say, okay, this conversation occurred, as opposed to what's the truth of the matter asserted. There's no particular, not seeking to establish
But I
a
guess
value that was discussed or something
I hear
like
you,
that.
but the dilemma that creates is you or the other side then might want to say, well, wait a minute, so if you talked about the weather, did you talk about how cold it was or how hot it was? And I think that's why it's appropriate if there's an objection to close the door even to that summary level, because then, unless you think both sides should be able to then get granular and say, well, apparently you talked about the weather, who said what about the weather? So I understand what you're saying, but I'm going to sustain the objection.
Okay. So, part of your job as being CFO, I heard you say that you may not be able to go out and plot drill points on a map or something like that. But as part of your job as CFO, do you have to have an understanding of what your business does?
Yes, ma'am. I've got to have an idea of the expenses that we incur when we go out and plot drill points on a piece of property. I've got to have an idea of what we need to, if we are seeking land for a particular customer. We will actually go out and drill for a particular customer, and we will then in turn send an invoice to that customer for those drill costs. So I've got to be able to review the cost and then add our overhead cost on top and add an estimated profit percentage on top. So I've got to have a general understanding of what is entailed from a drilling standpoint.
Okay. And how did you come to have that understanding of how the business worked? Did you take classes? Was it through some sort of, you know, what I would call on-the-job training, or just sort of generally how did you learn how Arcilla Mining and Land Company works?
A lot of it was on-the-job training. Mine was a new position with Arcilla Mining and Land. I wasn't replacing anybody. So a lot of what I had to review, had to analyze, I had to come up on my own with that aspect. So.
Okay. And when it came to doing the EBITDA value of the business, is it important to do that as correctly and to the best of your ability to come up with that value?
Yes, ma'am, it is. So especially when you're potentially buying or acquiring, buying or selling a portion. So you want to come up with a true value or an attempt at the correct value, so you don't lose out on a deal or get into something that you should not be getting into.
If you thought, when you did the EBITDA calculation for Arcilla Mining and Land Company, did you feel that you were competent to do that calculation?
Yes, ma'am. I had a general understanding of the business. I prepared the profit and loss statements for the prior 6 years. I had control of all transactions of the business. So based off my knowledge of the business, I was fully prepared to prepare those statements, prepare those EBITDA statements. So yes, I'd say on that regard, yes.
If you felt that you weren't competent to do that calculation, would you have done it?
No, ma'am, we probably would have sought someone from the outside to perform that.
Okay. You also told us about looking back at the check register and seeing that royalties were being paid to Arcilla Resources. Does Arcilla Mining and Land Company pay royalties to people just because you feel like it?
The question just before, or earlier?
About royalties in general, but earlier on direct.
Okay, but you can repeat the question, and if you don't remember it, you should repeat it, otherwise you can answer it.
Yeah, just repeat it, please.
Okay. Does Arcilla Mining and Land Company pay royalties to people for no reason?
No, ma'am, we pay royalties based upon the tonnage that we remove from the ground.
Does Arcilla Mining and Land Company pay royalties to Mr. McIver specifically for no reason?
No, ma'am. I don't know why we would do that.
All right.
So granted, that was before my time, but right now, when we pay a royalty, we pull the ton of kaolin out of the ground and sold it.
And you told us about in 2012 the check that went to Mr. McIver for $105,000, and you were asked about the $70,000 amount. And how did you characterize that amount? What did you call it?
I called it a,
Did you call it a loan?
I did not call it a loan. I called it goes against the potential future buyout.
Okay. Was there any written document where Mr. McIver promised to pay that money back?
No, ma'am.
All right. Was there any interest that Arcilla Mining and Land Company was charging to him on that $70,000?
No, ma'am.
Okay. And Mr. Abati asked you about your review of this letter from Mr. Smith. When you reviewed the letter, did you read it?
Yes, ma'am, I did.
When you read it, you told us that you were reviewing it for mainly sort of punctuation, grammar, and syntax, right?
Correct.
If you had seen some kind of error in the content, something in the letter that you knew was incorrect, would you have brought that to Mr. Smith's attention?
Yes, ma'am.
Was there anything in the letter that you read that you knew to be incorrect?
Based on my knowledge, no.
Okay. All right, thank you, Mr. Davenport.
Questions from the jurors for Mr. Davenport? Pass them to the left and down, please. You're welcome. Hello.
Hey,
If the value of Mr. McIver's interests as set forth in the letter that we've all been able to look at for a while was between $1.5 and $2.5 million, explain to the jurors why this agreement in the end was for $700,000.
I wasn't sure the exact value that Mr. Ted and Mr. McIver would agree upon. My EBITDA numbers that I ran was a little bit higher than that. The ending value was $700,000, but my EBITDA numbers were higher. And also I was relying on Mr. Ted to come up with the estimated minimal worth value. So that number was coming from him, but I felt comfortable with my number.
Okay. In part of your testimony, you mentioned something about some money being sent from your company to Mr. McIver or his company. If I say Mr. McIver, it could be Arcilla Resources. About some money covering taxes, the K-1, et cetera. Do you know if there are still payments being made from your company to Mr. McIver to cover taxes, or if taxes are somehow being withheld?
That was the annual, we annually sent out one payment each year to cover his taxable income that was pushed to Arcilla Resources. So I believe the last payment may have been in 2015, 2016. I'm not exactly sure, but it was one payment per year to cover that taxable income.
Okay, and is that still happening?
No, sir, it's not.
On an annual basis, and you may need to give us a few figures because you described there were some lean years and less lean years for your company. What are your company's annual earnings, revenues?
Revenue-wise, in 2014, we did $40 million. 2013, we did $40 million. 2014, we did $47 million. 2015 was the reduction. We went from $47 million to $30 million, so a large reduction. 2016, we did $31 million in annual revenue, so again, a large reduction. And then in 2017, we actually kicked back up and we had $46 million this year. So.
Okay, and of those 46, what were the earnings in the end when you back out all the expenses?
Let's see, 2013.
How about just 2017?
2017, net income, which is not it, but of a net income, I'm expecting us to do 1.5 from Arcilla Mining and 350 from Arcilla Trucking, so roughly 1.8.
1.8, 1.9 out of the 40-something million is not necessarily profit, but close to it. It's the net income.
Yes, sir, that's net income. And that's not, for an EBITDA base, you would add back certain things.
Got it. No, that's okay. And if either attorney wants you to get down into the accounting nitty-gritty, they are free to do that.
Okay, we'll hold classes later.
Good. Outside my presence.
Yeah.
If you know how much kaolin would have to be present in a particular tract of land to make its mineral rights worth $700,000. If that's not your area, that's what you need to tell us.
It's really not.
How about a lot versus a little tract of land? Would it have to be mineral rich to be valued at $700,000, or gosh, that's 3 ounces of kaolin?
It wouldn't take a lot of kaolin to get to $700,000.
Okay. Do you know the total paid in royalties up through, I think you said 2004 was the last royalty check cut to Mr. McIver or his company for that parcel we've been talking about? The total that was paid in royalties up through and including 2004?
No, sir, I do not.
Is there an average royalty check that you guys send out, or the tracts are so different in size and richness?
We're mining certain tracts much more aggressive than others. Certain tracts we're pulling 40 to 45,000 tons a year from. Certain tracts, 45,000 tons a month from. Certain tracts we're pulling 20,000 tons a month from. Certain
Just
tracts.
put a flavor, if I've got a tract that you're pulling 20,000 tons a month from, what would I be looking at in terms of a royalty check?
20,000 tons a month, you could potentially get $40,000 a month plus.
Okay, depending on the grade of the kaolin, et cetera.
Yeah, okay, sir.
At one point, you were describing the $105,000 payout. I think there was a tax chunk of it, and then there's the $70,000 that we've discussed. Was it an advance or a loan, et cetera? Is there a document that actually outlines, here's what the $105,000 is for, or you just know this from?
I just had an email from Mr. Ted Smith that said of the $105,000, 70 goes to a potential future buyout, and 35 goes to taxable income.
Okay. Can a tract be re-mined for kaolin? In other words, you're mining and then you stop. Is there any reason that once you stop, you can't go back to that tract and effectively reopen the mine?
Yes, sir, you can reopen a mine. There have been certain tracts of kaolin that were mined specifically for one plant or one processing plant. However, we have been able to go back in to those tracts and to find different types of kaolin that may have been considered junk kaolin or throwaway kaolin, and find a new processing plant that will gladly take many tons from that, what was once thought as junk cable.
Is there any particular reason you're aware of that the letter that we've all been looking at that refers to mineral worth on the 3 tracts would include the 1 tract that you've been able to talk about if it has already been mined and thus somewhat depleted, if that makes sense?
I'm not sure on that one.
Okay. I mean, you don't understand my question, or you
Well,
don't know how that was factored in?
I don't know how that was factored in. I don't know what particular value Mr. Ted was putting on each particular tract.
Okay. This is a permutation of 2 questions before about remining. Is there any requirement you're aware of that says if you stop mining a tract, it has to lay fallow for a certain amount of time before you all could go back in?
No, sir. You've got to have a mining permit. So that mining permit is granted through the Georgia EPD office. So we will come up to the Georgia EPD office and file for a permit. That permit will have to put an irrevocable letter of credit to the state, and we will have to provide a plan that shows we're actually going to move this dirt. We expect to pull out of this pit this amount of tonnage, and then we also have this plan for reclaiming the pit or the mine once we're finished mining. But as long as that permit is in effect, there's no limit. So now granted, a permit can lapse, but I can file for a new permit to reopen any mine that's, I guess, has not been mined in a while.
How long does a permit last?
We typically will mine any particular tract for 7+ to 10 years or so.
And you don't have to re-up the permit?
We do not have to re-up the permit, no sir. So they're indefinite. So there's not indefinite, but to my knowledge, there's no time limit on the permits.
Okay. You first,
I go
yes.
first.
Ms. Carter-Palmer, any follow-up
Yes.
based on those questions?
Yes, thank you. Mr. Davenport, Mr. McIver's minority shares in Arcilla Mining and Land Company, is that something that is separate from the tract of land that you know he has an interest in?
Yes, ma'am.
So the $700,000 that was in the purchase agreement, does that have anything to do with the mineral rights or mineral worth of his tract of land that he has an interest in?
No, ma'am, it does not.
All right. That solely relates to,
Objection leading.
what does that relate to?
The $700,000 solely relates to his 10% interest in Arcilla Mining Land and Arcilla Trucking Company.
Okay. You don't know the value of the tract of land he has an interest in?
No, ma'am, I do not.
Whatever, if there is any value to that tract of land, would that be above and beyond the $700,000 in the purchase agreement for his minority shares?
Based off Mr. Ted's letter, I'm assuming
Objection,
so.
also speculation.
I'm not sure I was calling for speculation, but I understood that his answer. So let me see if I can re-ask it. Without regards to what the letter says, but just if there is any value to the land that Mr. McIver has an interest in, is that value above and beyond and separate from the $700,000 value for his minority shares?
Objection, Your Honor. I would say that calls for speculation and hearsay. Because he's already said he doesn't know, and that his knowledge is based on what Mr. Ted told him.
Is that an accurate statement that Mr. Abate just made?
Well, I mean, he does own a tract of land, and any tract of land, you do have value associated with it. So based off that, then yes, he does have value higher than the $700,000.
All right. Okay, all right, thank you, that's my follow-up.
Mr. Abate, anything else?
Yes, Your Honor. Mr. Davenport, you talked about, I guess, the royalties when the judge asked you the question about how many or how much or or what the amount of the royalties that was paid to Mr. McIver? Do you remember that question?
Yes, sir, I did.
And I'm sorry, I didn't hear your answer. Did you know that amount?
No, sir, I did not.
We're looking at a copy of a spreadsheet that you produced to the District Attorney's Office on professional recollection.
It can, but I'll need a calculator.
Okay.
I should have put a total at the bottom, I didn't, I'm sorry.
Okay.
You mean
Yes.
add it up real quick?
Well, first, I guess, look at it and see if it refreshes your recollection. If it does,
Sorry.
you don't have to add it. You can just give me an estimation based on if your recollection is fresh. Well, do you recognize that document?
Yes, sir, I do recognize this document.
And is looking at that refresher recollection as to how much in royalties was paid to Mr. McIver from up until 2004.
Yes, sir, you could utilize this check register to total up the amount that was paid to Mr. McIver for royalties up until 2004.
And what is that amount?
I would have to estimate, but it's 3 pages. I don't know. You mean to add them all up real quick? Or? Okay.
Yes, please.
All right. 1, 2.
Do you need a calculator? Or you-
Well, I'm just going to add up the thousands in my head and just kind of roll with it and
Okay.
see where we go. But this will not be an accurate number. I'm literally just going to add up the thousands. Ready?
Okay.
Okay. Based off a quick addition without using a calculator, I'm expecting it was around $210,000.
And those payments stopped in 2004?
Yes, sir.
And on this sheet, can you show me where the last royalty payment was paid?
It was actually paid in January 2005 for December 2004.
Okay.
Sorry.
And on this sheet, it says, what is annual royalties for Burgess mean?
Annual royalties is for certain leases, we will make an annual payment, and that annual payment may be $10,000, maybe $20,000, maybe $50,000. So we'll make that at a particular time each year, and then we will effectively mine against that prepayment until that prepayment is recouped. So, and then after that prepayment is recouped, then we will send out royalty checks for the remainder of the year for any tonnage mined above the prepayment.
And of the, I guess, the numbers that you just added for the royalties paid monthly, none of the numbers were over $10,000 per month, correct?
I need to look at it again, I'm sorry.
I don't know, refresh your recollection.
Thank you.
You just let me know.
I've got 3 numbers at $25,000. I've got, there's 9,000, there's a couple 10,000s.
But the $25,000 ones that you're speaking of,
Yes, sir.
those aren't monthly, those are the annual royalty payments that were paid for the tract of land, correct?
Yes, sir, that's correct.
So I guess my question was, none of the monthly royalties that were paid to Mr. McIver over, I guess, the span of 1997 to 2004 ever were above $10,000, correct?
With the exception of the annual prepayment, it doesn't appear to be. So, no, sir.
Okay, because the annual is for the full year, not just for 1 month.
That's correct. You made an annual payment every year, and you mine against that. So, yeah. Yes, sir.
And then you talked about, I guess, when you were answering some of the questions about the tract of land, and then you earlier said that you've done some research about the tract of land that's located in Twiggs County that we've been talking about. And when you were doing the research, did you see that the tax assessor had appraised that piece of land for $41,000?
I object to the question. Present.
Remind me how we first learned that this witness was aware of the track. Was it something you were exploring with him, or did it come out during cross?
It came out.
Because there was some, I'm recalling some testimony about, I looked at some land records and X.
Okay, on cross, Mr. Abadi was asking him, you know, remember our conversation last Friday, he told me he didn't know where the land was, and in response to that, he said, well, after our conversation, I went and looked up to figure out where the land was to put it on the map.
Okay.
And that's how it came up.
And Your Honor, the reason I asked those questions is because on direct, he was asked a question about the tract of land where it elicited the statements that he had done research and found out the properties were located in Twiggs County.
Okay, that's what I would remember.
And I got an objection to that question, and he wasn't allowed to answer.
The objection was overruled, and he was allowed to answer about where the property was located and how he found it in the property records. He wasn't allowed to talk about what Mr. Ted said, but he was able to talk about the property records that he had located. And that's how the Twiggs County stuff came out.
Okay, I know we're not going to necessarily resolve the different, I have a different recollection, because I remember Your Honor saying, well, he's talking about pulling up something and reading something on a screen, he can't get into that, and I thought the objection was sustained, but in any event, I did not ask him about the, other than the one track that he knows about.
Which is what I think this question is about.
That's correct.
Okay, so maybe we could get clarification on that, the ones that he had to go pull up on the,
My understanding is he's only been able to learn about one, and that's the one he's been talking about. But he did learn about it through some research, about which he discussed through questions from you as well as questions from the state.
okay, I did not elicit from him, okay, well, what's the value of that land? Because we established the only way that he may know that would be through some hearsay. And secondly, whatever the tax assessor's value of the land is would be irrelevant. That's not what has been discussed here, which is dealing with mineral rights in Kaolin, which is not something the tax assessor deals with.
My response would be that the tax assessor's value is irrelevant. Mr. Ted's
I don't think it's irrelevant. I'm working through the hearsay angle to this. How is there not a good faith basis based on official records that wouldn't be hearsay? To ask the question. Whether he knows it or not is a different thing. Of course, the question is not evidence.
If he is allowed to ask a question about what he has gone and looked up on the clerk's website, then I would like some follow-up about other things that may have shown up on the clerk's website.
If it's not hearsay because it's an official record,
May I add, I'm so sorry, looking something up on a website is not an official record. You may be able to get something from that entity that would have a business record certification with it, but looking it up on the website doesn't make it a business
no, I
record.
appreciate that, but in the end, if there's a good faith basis to believe that the official record that I have no doubt the state could get, this is cross-examination. There's a good faith basis to ask that, and it isn't, that basis ultimately wouldn't be hearsay. I don't know that.
And may I have some brief follow-up on other things that might be found out in...
Well, that's what I was going to ask. Why wouldn't the same apply in the other direction? Except that it can't be a leading question, and so you can't load a lot of content into it in the way you can with a leading question.
Agreed.
Okay. All right. So why don't you ask the question again? And this witness has been on staff for a long time for this issue, but you asked your question.
My question was, is through your research into, I guess, the land, the tract we've been talking about in Twiggs County, did you learn that the tax assessor had evaluated the land at $41,000?
No, sir, I didn't look at that number. I simply looked at the location of the property.
No further questions.
Okay.
Just very brief on that initiative.
Sure.
Mr. Davenport, when you went and looked, what is it, where did you go look?
There's it's a government website, it's Q Public. Every county has one. You can type in Q Public and then pick a particular type of county or a particular county, and then you can type in location addresses or people's names, and you can find, it's a public record of all property held throughout the state of Georgia. So if I wanted to go look up something, I would type in somebody's name and go find out what they owned in a particular county.
Okay. And what did you type in when you looked it up in this case?
In this case, I typed in Arcilla Resources, and from Arcilla Resources, there were, I think in Twigs, at least there was one tract that popped up. Might have been two, but there was the tract that I clicked on was this particular tract, and the location of it was immediately east of where we're currently mining one tract and immediately south of where we're currently mining one tract.
Did you see any other tracts of land owned in Twigs or any other county by Arcilla Resources?
I can't recall.
Okay, thank you.
So, folks, I want to share something with you that may seem nuanced, but it's important. The question that Mr. Abate asked about some tax assessor value, that question, of course, is not evidence. And the witness gave the answer the witness gave. If the answer was, I don't know that to be true, then you don't know that, and no one has presented you with evidence as to what a tax assessor may have said the value of the parcel is or not. The evidence would come from a document or from a witness, what the witness said. I'm not telling you what you recall the witness said. If the witness embraced it, then there might be some evidence as to an assessed value. If the witness didn't embrace that, said I'm not familiar with that information, then you don't have any information that you ought to rely on in making a decision about an assessed value, because questions aren't evidence, it's the answers. Okay? You're free to go.
Thank you. Thank you.
Next witness.
Blair Brown.
I'm sorry?
Blair Brown. We gotta find an exhibit real quick.
Can you start, or is the very first thing you do?
I'm gonna ask 3 questions, so I can start. We won't get very
Just hit a
far.
wall.
Yeah. Plus, we're gonna have to get the monitor working, but we'll do it quick.
Okay.
Do we re-swear witnesses who've already been sworn, or?
Boy, it's been a minute. We
Yeah, it's
better
been.
swear Ms. Brown. Not that I have any doubts that she will testify truthfully, but she may not even remember you people. Okay. This is going to be a quick witness. Should we take our break now, or can we make it through this witness? We make it through? Okay. All right. I didn't even mischaracterize. You said 3 questions, and so the jurors wanted to mischaracterize 3 questions. Okay. But even the lawyer's 3 is pretty quick. Let's swear Ms. Brown in,
Do
please.
you swear and affirm that the testimony you should give in court today will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Yes, ma'am. If you will, have a seat. Get as close to the mic as you can.
Okay.
For the purposes of the court's record, please state
Sorry.
please state and spell your name.
Blair Brown, BLAIR BROWN.
They seem like a Mobius strip. We're back to Emory again, but it never ends. You are employed where?
Emory University Healthcare.
Okay. And right now, which facility are you at?
Now I'm at Emory Midtown.
Okay. And back in September of 2016, where were you?
I was at Emory Main Campus off Clifton Road.
Okay. And what department were you with at that time?
Emergency Department.
Okay. And you've testified already?
I have.
But it was a month ago.
Yes.
Thank you for coming back. I just have a very short question to ask you, and I'm going to ask you to just to refocus us. You were in the ER the night of September 25th, 2016, is that right?
Yes.
And do you recall the car coming in with Mr. McIver, Tex McIver?
I do.
You testified about that.
Yes.
And were you one of the nurses that went out to the valet area?
I was.
And again, just very, very quickly, the circumstances were what I'm delaying here, as you can tell. This is a 4 corners while I'm waiting for the video to come up.
Yeah.
What were the circumstances? What led you to go outside?
I was carrying a walkie-talkie at the time. I had overheard that they needed assistance in the valet area, and I did not have a patient at the time, so I went out there to help.
And then what did you do?
When I got out to the valet area, another nurse was already out there,
Who was that?
Allison Neely, and they were trying to get a woman out of the front seat of the car into a wheelchair, so I helped assist do that and then push her inside.
So where were you with the wheelchair?
I was on the right side of the wheelchair and then picking up her right leg, I believe. Yes.
Take a look at the screen, if you would. This is State's Exhibit 217. And if we could roll it, please. And you can give us a commentary while it's going. This is the entrance to the ER, correct?
And that's
The
the
horseshoe.
white SUV to the right.
There it is. And that is Mr. McIver in the red shirt, is that correct?
Correct.
Tell us when you come out of the door there, if you would. That's a patient, all right? There's a wheelchair?
Yes.
McIver's now in the wheelchair, correct?
It appears so.
And now who's that coming in?
That's Allison Neely.
Okay, and behind her? Is that you behind her?
No, that's just Allison.
No.
Oh, there's one, sorry.
There's you. And that-
Yes.
Both nurses are in the picture?
Yes.
Okay, let's just get into the door. You are now holding up her right leg, correct?
Correct.
Mr. McIver's holding up her left leg, correct?
Correct.
And Nurse Neely is behind.
Correct.
Okay. And then the door you got. Okay? Let's look at the inside for a minute. Yeah, this is now, you've come into the door, which is in the picture, and now we've got the surveillance camera. That's the valet coming in first. That's Nurse Neely going out.
Correct.
That's you going out.
Correct.
Coming in now.
Yes.
Okay, you're still in the same position. Mr. McIver's left leg, your right leg.
Yes.
Wait, could you stop there for 1 second? How close are you to Mr. McIver right here? I mean, we can see the video, but if he was talking, would you hear him?
Yeah, probably 18 inches from him.
18 inches. Okay, keep moving, please. Okay. And then you head from there, I don't have the fancy scanner here, but straight into the ER trauma room, correct?
Correct. Room 2.
Room 2. And how far is it from this door to room 2?
Maybe 4 meters.
You talking meters? Where are you from?
West Mid.
4 meters, all right. And then into the ER you got, correct?
Yes.
And do you go into the ER or does...
Into
Do you
room
go
2?
into the room?
Yes, I did go into room 2.
Okay. And here's my one of 3 questions. Did you, I told you, as a lawyer's 3. Did you hear, while you were 18 inches away, Tex McIver say,
Objection.
I haven't finished the...
questions reading.
I'm asking whether she heard something. It's not leading anything.
You can ask, what did she hear her say anything?
That is not correct. I can ask, did she hear X? It's not suggesting an answer.
I don't disagree, but what's it mean?
Go ahead. Did you hear Tex McIver say, I shot her in the bathroom while I was cleaning the gun?
No.
And did you remain 18 inches away from him, until you got into the room?
I believe at the entrance of the room, he stepped aside and let us nurses take over to put her on the bed and so forth.
But during the time that you were alongside the wheelchair and Nurse Neely was behind the wheelchair, pushing the wheelchair, you did not hear him say those things?
Correct, I did not hear him say those things.
So those are my 3 questions.
Ms. Griffin, any questions this time for Ms. Brown?
Good morning.
Good morning.
We just watched the video of the defendant coming into the hospital, right?
Yes.
And you said that you were there from the time that you took her out of the car and brought her into ER room 2, right?
Yes.
And during that time, you saw him and you saw what he was doing?
Yes.
And when you all came out, so if he said that people were scurrying around and a gurney comes out and he helps load her on the gurney, would that be true or false?
Well, a gurney never came out of the room. The gurney was always planted in room 2.
Did you ever take a gurney outside?
No.
Okay. And if he says that as you all were walking into the hospital, he was holding her hand, would that be true or false?
I did not see her holding, him holding her hand. He was holding her left leg.
And when you say he was holding her left leg, did he grab it on his own, or how did he come to hold her left leg?
I asked him to hold it up so that we could move her in the wheelchair.
And when you asked him to hold it up, just tell the jury how you had to tell her.
So when she was in the wheelchair, you could see her kind of laying limp, and Miss Neely tried to push, and obviously we weren't going anywhere with her legs dragging, with her left leg dragging, so I said, pick up her leg, pick up your wife's leg, and he picked it up and we started moving.
Okay, and while you were trying to get Miss McIver to ER room 2, were you focused on what he was saying or what he was talking about?
No, I was focused on the patient and just getting to room 2. And also, at that time when we were moving, I radioed to my charge nurse that we were coming to room 2.
Okay. I have no question.
Can you redirect? You get to do that.
Can't remember how. Regardless of whether you're focusing or not, when you're 18 inches away, would you have heard him say?
Objection, Your Honor, leading.
It's not leading. Did you hear him say, I shot my wife in the bathroom while I was cleaning my gun?
I did not hear him say that.
Any questions from the jurors for Ms. Brown this time around that you forgot to ask last time? No? All right. Thank you, ma'am, for being here. I don't think we'll bring you back in, but just be ready. All right, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to take our morning break. I know a couple of you asked for it even sooner than that, but we had a witness. We've taken care of that witness. It's Wednesday. Go have your morning break. We'll get you back in here in a few minutes, and we'll keep making progress. Thanks for your attention so far. We'll talk about the case during break.
All rise for the jurors. Please be seated.
Mr. Samuel, anything we need to take up before we enjoy our morning break? From the state? No. Okay. Let's be back a little before 10:50 on the gold-plated clock. Please.